Okay, so welcome. I want to thank you all for joining us for the third panel in the Why Arts Matter series. This is a series that brings together researchers, artists, and community voices to explore how the arts intersect with other disciplines and spark conversations that reach beyond the university. The arts and humanities, whether history, philosophy, languages, fine arts, theatre, or music, are not separate from the sciences or other fields, but deeply interconnected with how we navigate personal, social, and global challenges. At its core, Why Arts Matter affirms the essential role of the arts in offering critical perspectives, creative insight, and diverse ways of understanding ourselves and the world. So today we're excited to continue that dialogue with our panel on technology, the arts and technology, featuring Peter Cooling, Susan Brown, Rosita Dara, and Donald Bruce. And I'm going to introduce our speakers in a second, and after we've had our conversation, we're going to end this discussion with time for audience questions. So as it goes on, if questions occur, you'll have the chance to put them to the panel at the end. I want to just say before we get going that we're grateful to continue this series in the Improv Lab today, in this beautiful space. It's a space designed for creative exploration, collaboration, and experimentation. It's a place where ideas come to life, where dialogue sparks innovation, and where the impact of the arts can be felt in real time. Coming at you in real time today. It's also, of course, important to recognize that the University of Guelph resides on the ancestral lands of the Atawandaron and the Haudenosaunee people, and the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We uphold the significance of the Dish with One Spoon covenant and the continuing relationship our Indigenous neighbors have with this land. We recognize that today this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging them reminds us of our relationships to this land where we learn and work. We commit to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, and I think we all understand that we must do more to learn, share, and support truth and healing. Okay, it's my pleasant duty now to introduce the panelists. So on my immediate left, we have Peter Cooling, Dr. Peter Cooling. Peter is Associate Professor of Theatre in the School of Theatre, English and Creative Writing here at the U of G. He teaches courses on Shakespeare and early modern drama, as well as Canadian theatre and literature. His research explores how new media, virtual reality, video games, digital or technological innovations changes and enhances our appreciation of all kinds of theatre and performance experiences. He's recently directed two amazing Shakespeare VR projects, the Hamlet VR experience and the Macbeth VR experience. Both feature casts from the Stratford Festival and were developed with the Simway VR, and they were developed as free digital teaching tools for high schools, colleges, and universities throughout Ontario. I've experienced them both, and they are amazing. He's also an associate editor for the International Journal of Performance Arts and Digital Media. I guess I'm going to go in the order these are written down, so I'm going to skip across to Rosita, Dr. Rosita Dara. Rosita is an associate professor at the School of Computer Science and the director of Artificial Intelligence for Food, AI for Food, here at the University of Guelph. Dr. Dara has established an interdisciplinary research program that spans applied artificial intelligence and data and technology governance, with a particular focus on agri-food systems, and we're really grateful that you're here. Thank you so much for being here, Rosita. Susan Brown. Dr. Susan Brown is a professor of English and Canada Research Chair in Collaborative Digital Scholarship at the U of G. Her work explores intersectional feminism, literary history, semantic technologies, and scholarly research infrastructure. She's a founding director of the Orlando Project on British women writers and directs two major digital infrastructure projects, Quirk, the Canadian Writing Research Collaboratory, Virtual Research Environment, and LINKS, the Linked Infrastructure for Network Cultural Scholarship. Both huge projects. Susan is a very, very busy person. And lastly, but certainly not least, of course, Dr. Donald Bruce. Don was Dean of Arts at the University of Guelph from 2006 to 2017. We spent many years working together while you were in that role. Subsequently, he was the coordinator of the interdisciplinary and very successful Bachelor of Arts and Science program from 2017 to 2024. Before coming to Guelph, he was at the University of Alberta, and there he has helped establish the MA in Humanities Computing. And here at Guelph, he established the Michael Ridley Postdoctoral Fellowship in Digital Humanities in partnership with the library, who have been excellent partners with us in the digital humanities space, and the CRC in digital humanities, which Susan is the holder of. His main areas of interest are in the interface between arts and sciences, and Don has regularly taught BAS courses on the social embeddedness of science, science communication, and science in film. So, super excited to have you here. This is going to be a very interesting conversation. I'm going to let them talk in just one second. I'm just going to introduce the topic and then turn things over. So, the topic of this panel presentation is Why Arts Matter, Technology. So this panel, we're hoping, is going to explore the transformative impact of technology on our understanding of the world and ourselves, focusing on how digital performance, virtual reality, and artificial intelligence are shaping cultural engagement and artistic expression. So, very timely topic. The discussion will examine the ethical implications of AI and the use of technology. It'll also look at critical infrastructure in the digital humanities that fosters collaborative knowledge production, diversity, and inclusivity. Additionally, this is a big long list, so we'll see how many of these we actually get to talk about. But additionally, the panel will address the portrayal of science and tech in various media and its influence on public understanding, while highlighting the role technology, AI, and digital humanities play in inclusive learning environments. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Okay, so we're going to start out. I'm going to invite each panelist to give us a quick overview of their initial thoughts on this grab bag of timely topics for a couple of minutes, and then we will start the conversation. So. We didn't actually decide who was going to go first. Peter, is it okay if I ask you to go first, and we'll just go in that direction?
That's completely fine.
Awesome.
Thank you for that incredible introduction. It's so great to be here to talk with everyone. I honestly really think that the arts are always something that all the discipline of the arts are always something that are using technology so effectively and so innovatively to shift and change how we perceive of these kinds of cultural products. I know it sounds a little bit reductive, but I first got interested in technology thinking about the printing press and thinking about innovations that are hundreds of years old, to then now get interested in things like VR and video games that are changing the way that we use technology to demonstrate art and interest. You know, the idea that during the pandemic, we could live stream theater performances from London to our students was absolutely amazing and fascinating. But it's not just these technologies being present to me, it's what artists are actually doing to change our perception of how art can interact with us. I thought I knew how to direct plays on stage, and then suddenly I was like, I need to direct these in virtual reality and find ways to get you interested not just in what's in front of you, but what could be all around you at any given point in any given space. So reconceptualizing the work we do across arts disciplines, to me, is a question of what technologies we're encountering and how do they make us better artists, creators, and sort of innovators to push things forward.
Excellent. Thank you. Susan.
Yeah, I would echo much of what Peter has said about not seeing a sort of opposition between arts and technology, but seeing a symbiosis. Going back before the printing press, the stylus for writing on papyrus is a technology, right? We create technologies. They're not alien to us. They're part of us. But I'm very interested in how they shape us and the things that they enable us to do in new ways, how we interact with them and make them our own in this context of thinking about the arts and culture. And so for the Orlando project, which was a revisionist history of women's writing, we're trying to find all these rare books. I was in the early days of the project ordering all these 19th century books from Yale and Harvard and these collections, and sometimes you couldn't get anything. I had, reams and reams and reams of files. I had to go to archives to read things and read them as fast as I could to, make the most of my time there. And all those files can be thrown out now. Like the access that we have to culture, to our histories, the amazingly rich record of human creativity and expression. It's available to people with pretty minimal computing power these days. So we tend to use, the word technology is synonymous with the digital, but there really is a kind of continuum in terms of what we've been able to do with it. And I think that the sort of early promise of the web in terms of democratizing is seen very powerfully in the way that we have access to things, and we can change the stories that we tell about the past because we have access to things in the past that can be shared with not just other scholars through print publications and journals, but with the general public. And so, that's why I'm interested in platforms. I'm also interested in platforms as things that do shape and constrain what we do and the power of platforms in the society that we live in. I'm very interested to hear what you're going to talk about in terms of governance, because like when you compare the early days of the web, where people could just throw up a website very easily, and that's where a lot of really early creative stuff and a lot of early sharing of cultural materials and products happened, even though it was clunky and slow and there was no streaming and all that stuff. Right now, platforms are sort of determining how people communicate, how people share, how people express themselves. And I'm talking about everything from operating systems to like social media platforms. And so the extent to which platforms are being developed in the service of profit and not in the service of, human creativity, expression, open sharing, and so on is a big concern.
Awesome. Thank you. Rosita?
I'm a technical person. My background is artificial intelligence and by training, and also privacy as well, or governance, again, from technical perspective. So I hope I can contribute to this discussion. So I look at myself as a user of, AI in arts, when you go to theatrical production and then you're able to interact with the with the play and then vote, and so some interesting engagement. You can also, for example, personalize art. So that's also another interesting aspect that occasionally, if I have a chance, if I have time, I will explore. And also, I'm not an artist, but what these tools can offer. I mean, my art skills are close to zero, but sometimes for research or for other purposes, I have to use these tools, AI-generated images, and obviously text also. So what they can do and how you can express yourself, through those tools and devices is quite amazing. It's quite fascinating. So that's my perspective. That's how I look at it. As opportunity. So obviously there are also challenges that I will talk about it when it comes to governance and ethical aspect. But I'm quite fascinated by what Sarah, has been working. Susan, sorry, has been leading. Sorry, I've been in 3 panels today. So anyway, Susan has been doing. So I'm quite amazed. I mean, we have had discussions earlier a few years ago about what she has been doing, and I have been following what you have been doing, and the progress is quite fascinating. So congratulations for that.
Thanks, Rosita. This is your 3rd panel today. That's commitment.
I don't know
That's
why.
amazing. You're in
happened.
demand. Don, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. I'll make 3 observations on sort of what I've seen experience here over the last 20 years. When I came here as Dean of Arts in 2006, there wasn't a whole lot going on in terms of the application of digital technologies to teaching and research, unless Susan was doing it, because she's been the pioneer here since the very beginning. And I remember well one unnamed arts professor saying, all this digital humanities stuff, what a waste of time. It's a fad, it's gonna go away. These are just toys. This isn't real art scholarship. It's got no value whatsoever. Well, things have changed. Leap ahead 15 years, COVID comes. And we had accomplished a lot, I think, between 2006 and 2020. However, when COVID came and we found ourselves all being stampeded to have to teach online, were we ready? No. And we were very, very unready, even though, of course, many of the tools had already existed for some time. So we all had to scamper feverishly to learn how to work online, learn the tools. Everyone ran to YouTube to figure out how to do things. And so we got through that, but it was not really something it was something we should have been prepared for, and we simply weren't developed enough. Observation number 2. Because of the rapid development and the improvement of the digital technologies, and particularly the last few years with generative AI, ChatGPT coming along, because some of the other tools have been around for a long time, there's sort of a question we have to ask ourselves. What's actually the base load, the base level of knowledge that we should expect of our students or of a citizen living in a highly advanced technological society such as ours? Because I've certainly had students in class with whom I've had a discussion, and this happened, for example, in the science communication class where we spent a lot of time looking at communication, and people would say, well, why should I bother learning grammar and rhetoric and all these other things? I can just get GPT to do it for me. It'll write what I need. And then along with that will come things like, well, why spend all this time learning history and philosophy? I can just look it up in Google. And so that quest does raise a really fundamental question. As the tools have become more proficient, as they allowed us to do more things and freed us from some of the drudgery, like those files that you have in your filing cabinet, I've got a lot of those too, we have to ask ourselves, that changes with time, what is the level of knowledge that individual students, we as citizens, should have in mathematics, in science, in literature, in philosophy, in history, all these sorts of things that make up a citizen. So that question is still up in the air. And in fact, just a week ago at the Perimeter Institute, Derek Muller, who runs Veritasium on YouTube, a science communication channel, gave a whole talk on that. And if you go to the Perimeter Institute channel, you'll see that. So his talk was focused exactly on what do we do in education now that AI is here. Third observation, and this kind of picks up on the first one I made. As a result of having to be online for that whole time in 2020, in the BAS program, we completely redid our pedagogy. We turned everything to flipped classrooms. We broke down all the classes into groups of 50. We created teams of 5 in all of the classes. And what the technology allowed us to do was not to lecture, but to engage and participate in the classroom. So thanks to the technology, we were able to realize the pedagogical goals, which sometimes really didn't get realized when we used the old methods.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Don. That's very interesting. So I'm going to suggest that there's a whole bunch of themes emerging from this. I'm going to pick out 3, and I'll invite us to talk about those, and then we'll sort of see what else comes out from the conversation. So I think one theme is the sort of symbiosis between technology and the arts understood broadly, right? So the way in which the arts are part of generating that technology, responding to that technology, whether that technology sort of makes the art, as it were, better or worse. I think that will be a super interesting thing to talk about. I think the way in which the arts and humanities can play a role in helping us respond to technological innovation. I feel like that's something that came out in your remarks, Don, and that seems like a very timely theme, right? What are we doing in terms of preparing people as citizens in an age where we have new technological tools? And I think the whole sort of the third theme would be the governance question, right? So the pitfalls of all of that, the ways in which it could go horribly wrong, and what do we need to be aware of, and how, again, do the arts and the humanities help us to cope with and respond to all of that. So let's do the symbiosis bit first, if that's okay. So I think, Peter, you were sort of introducing that idea. Susan, I feel like you picked up on that. I'll ask it in a slightly controversial way, and then over to you guys. I mean, are the arts passive recipients of technological innovation? Do we have to say, oh, well, now we've got VR, so now we have to work out how we do theatre in an age of VR? Or is it, I take it it's a more nuanced relationship than that. So what is the relationship between technological advance and the arts?
I mean, I go back to thinking about, like, what have other advancements done to theater and performance over centuries and over time. And like Orson Welles in the Mercury Theater, and responding to cinema and this idea of a new way of storytelling, and saying, how do I have to now think about the artistic premise of lighting design and stage design to innovate and to push things forward? Because I will say, first off, that I don't think theater in VR is the theater we know. It's something performative and interesting and engaging, but it's a totally different beast. But it might make our theater artists, all of our artists, think about what can they do differently to engage broader publics or broader audiences. So ultimately, I think it pushes the arts to think about what untapped potential do we have that we can innovate on as a result. It almost exists parallel to it. It's in tandem and informing these existing, whether it's dance or music or other things. I mean, music has certainly responded to AI-generated sort of music and experiences, and innovated and finding other ways. So,
I'm going to push on this even further. AI wouldn't exist, like what we think of when we think of large language models. It wouldn't exist without the arts. Like, it's the biggest intellectual property theft in history, in that it had to be trained on human-produced language. That it is the direct output of the arts. Our search engines are the result of language, really important research in trying to figure out how to crack hard problems in the humanities. That was the foundation of, what's the big company in the big the big Waterloo company that isn't BlackBerry, the other one, RIM. No, that's BlackBerry, the other one. Anyway, I've forgotten the name of it. But yeah, that whole it's one of Canada's largest software companies. It comes out of a research project to try and crack the problem of how to index the Oxford English Dictionary. Open text, yes, thank you. Yeah, text, there we go again, right? So our language, our text, the whole history of human creativity, both visual and verbal, is what has produced these amazing technologies that we're now struggling with. There's obviously a politics, I've made my position on it clear, to how that's been done and in the service of what, right? It's being, human creativity is now being sold back to us and leveraged for purposes that are, quite inimical, I think, to the values of many of the people whose work has gone into that. And I'm not just talking about like the sort of high art, I'm talking about like the art of humor on Reddit, right? Like it's all of us who have contributed to this, right? It's all of our words, all of our, it's just been, absorbed by these technologies. So they are as dependent upon us as we are upon them. And it's how we navigate that relationship and negotiate it and regulate it that I think really matters.
So it is kind of a symbiotic relationship. Definitely, I mean, especially with my research, I use AI to be able to create narrative for people who are not tech savvy. So I have learned to use extremely complex AI and multimodal data to simplify it and collaborate and communicate information with people who don't understand any of that. That has been quite challenging and very rewarding. Because of my background, so I worked at BlackBerry, and it was quite applied, Privacy Commissioner's Office. When I came to University of Guelph, I realized I cannot do the traditional deep learning, multi-layer, algorithms. I wasn't interested in it anymore. But at the same time, finding the language to be able to communicate with people who are not technical. They find AI fascinating, but you lose this in discussion. You lose them. So this experience, especially with new large language models, generative models, so it's becoming slightly easier. AR, augmented reality. It's gradually becoming easier to have that conversation with them. Take that complex algorithms input and try to communicate much type of information that they understand. So this has been an interesting journey. And I was speaking in one of the panels this morning that it's becoming easier and easier to have this conversation. Explainable AI, communicating text, visual, augmented reality, build kind of digital twin environment to be able to talk about disease outbreak. So there are obviously lots of governance challenges, lots of ethical challenges. If you can find a way to maneuver, it's an amazing technology that you can find a way to communicate with every generation and background and language. So it is becoming easier and easier to some extent.
I think so. The human story has always been that every time a new technology arises, the printing press, perspective in art, on it goes, that creativity bursts out. They find new ways to use things. And so I don't think that arts reacts in a sort of slavish or necessary fashion when a scientific innovation or technological innovation is brought into the whole arts area. But people's minds, the little wheels, get turning, and they find new things that they can do with that. So, for example, Peter, with his work in VR, in my science communication class, I get the students to imagine building a science exhibit, an interactive science exhibit, if they were doing something in the science center. So all the different teams have to think that out. They can only do it on paper and write it down and then come up and talk about it. But if we could do a VR building of that sort of thing, if we had relatively simple tools to do that, then they would be able to engage in that kind of experience. And who knows how many other doors I might open for them and the insights that would generate.
Yeah, and I think that's also the question, though, is, using these new technologies for training and process and procedure is excellent, absolutely. But then who's leveraging it into new kinds of experiences? I've recently been sort of exploring VR that tries to tell more emotional and effective stories about being Indigenous in the North, or there's one about Japanese internment in Canada that happened, and sort of going through stories and narratives in those ways, which feel, for those of us who love teaching or training models, a little bit more loose and open. I learned very quickly that all the students I put into Hamlet tried to kill the ghost by throwing their lantern at the ghost. They don't want to play the play, they want to attack the ghost. And I learned very quickly not just how artists innovate, but how the players or the audience innovate. What buttons do they toggle? What do they push against to break the system? And in some ways, that's audience feedback I don't get in a traditional theater, where people are quiet or clapping or laughing or leaving. But here I get to see them actually trying to engage, and it might force me to think, what do I have to do beyond the AI development to make it more of a procedure and experience?
So, I mean, we've got a sort of exciting suite of new tools that help us create culture, create art differently. I guess there might be a view, though, that says this particular technological innovation is different, right? So as you were sort of suggesting, Susan, it's gulped up all of human culture, and it's automating it, right? It's producing its own musical pieces, its own pieces of visual art and so on. Is this different than the printing press and different than the invention perspective because it's no longer human in the same way? Is that a concern that you would share?
I have a thought. Maybe sometimes it's more human and stereotype because it's just regurgitating the language models that exist and it's not innovating. I mean, certainly that's a question I've had. I've had students ask AI to tell them what Hamlet wants or what he means, and it's just regurgitating that Hamlet is a one-note person who's procrastinating and all these things they learn in high school, and it's not teaching them much beyond the general. So maybe it's regurgitating a version of ourselves that we want to push against at times. I'm not sure. That's a first insight.
Maybe in part it also depends on to what extent, and AI's got a long way to develop, to go. But of course there's this notion of the synchronicity, when in fact AI gets to this point where it is actually...
The singularity?
Singularity, yeah. Thank you, the singularity, that's the right term. Fuses with and goes beyond the human mind and the human capabilities. And of course, the recent film, Garland's film, Ex Machina, it works on that. So when I was watching the presentation by Derek Muller from the Perimeter, a little girl came up and asked him that question because he was sort of saying, well, AI is just another tool that we can use because it leads us to increase our human interaction. Entirely correct. And this little girl comes up, maybe she thought of it, maybe some gave her the question, said, but what happens when the AI seems human-like? And you think that you're actually speaking and interacting with another human, and you develop emotions and feelings for that other human. Do we move then to that new level? That's a long way off.
I think people have very effective relationships with their phones. So affect. Like I had a student once in a grad class who had lost his phone, and it was like he'd lost a limb. He was so agitated. Like I think I actually don't think that the boundary between humans and machines is a very distinct one at this point. Donna Haraway, I think almost 40 years ago, said we're all cyborgs, right? And cyborg is a sort of pairing of cybernetics and organisms, so the biological and particularly the information technology, right? And we outsource our memories. Like there are all sorts of ways in which we are, interacting with and dependent upon, and have, many of us have machines embedded in our bodies in various ways and are, wearing them and so on. So there's no question, I think, that we're collaborating with machines all the time. Mm-hmm. The question of when this becomes a problem, I think, comes down again to like the politics of the particular technology in a particular context. And people have been, like the Oulipo movement was a very generative movement in early 20th century France, where they would sort of essentially set up algorithms for producing art. So one of the famous outputs was an entire novel in French. If you know the language French, this will be quite astounding. An entire novel in French written without using the the letter E. Right, so there's a constraint imposed upon the text. It's very very algorithmic process. Entirely independent of what we would think of as a computer. But you can think of AIs as just very fancy algorithms. They're still produced by us and made by us for particular purposes. And it's what are those purposes, and to what end, and do we approve of them, or are we being manipulated by them and used by them in ways that are actually not in our best interests. So platforms, when I'm thinking particularly of social media platforms, they want our attention, they want our time, they want our money, they want our words and our interactions, so that they can sell us stuff. And so they can leverage that knowledge in other ways as data, right? So there's this notion of surveillance capitalism or platform capitalism that uses our information as a source of wealth, right? So data is the new oil, all of that sort of thinking. None of these systems are interested in fostering human interactions for their own sake, and they're certainly not interested in preserving human culture and human expression and human creativity. So I worry a lot about how much these platforms are being used as repositories of the things that we make and the things that we that spark us and give us joy and pleasure and all these things, right? And platforms just disappear like that, right? And then it's all gone, right? And so I am concerned about these sorts of particular uses, and how do we carve out space in the world that we're in to use the technology in ways that are, going to help feed people, as opposed to necessarily just make more money. Yeah.
So is there something that looks like resistance that should be taking place, right? So is there a way in which technology could be going wrong, and are the arts, culture, humanities part of that resistance in a fruitful way? Does that question make sense?
Well, there are those famous posters, which some of you may have seen around, where on the one hand you've got science tells you how to make a dinosaur, and the next poster is the arts tells you why we shouldn't make a dinosaur, and the dinosaur is running after the person in Jurassic Park, trying to eat them. So I think that's entirely true. And in a program like the BAS, the one that I work in, that's a sort of an area of discussion and inquiry we're always engaged in. So how do we derive the benefits that technology and science has provided to us? And we just have to look around. Everything in this room, virtually, except us, is the product of science and technology, because it's all come out of the ground, it's all been processed, it's all been transformed into something else. So we're surrounded by technology and science at all times, but we often aren't aware of that to that extent. So I find that the type of inquiry that we work on in that program really does heighten the awareness of the students about, and they're the young people moving forward, they'll become the decision makers and so forth in the years ahead, but it certainly awakens their awareness of the advantages and the problems and makes them more critically prepared to deal with these new technologies as they come along.
The trouble with the post you mentioned is that I want us to make dinosaurs. Like I feel like I react the wrong way to that message. Rosita.
Yeah, sure. So I wanted to say, if I look at the user group of AI, I think we have to separate them. So for me, I use social media a lot and get some part of the news and information through that platform. But I have learned, I think the way I have been raised or based on my experience, I look at many different sources. So what worries me about, the new generation and how they interact with these tools, where the source of information come from. I mean, where they are getting the source of information, fake news, fake information that these new generative tools are able to generate based on, kind of online data, kind of sentiment analysis, new trends, or the source of information wherever it comes from. So what scares me and how that information gets generated, with what intention, and for what group of people it has been created, and what they want to gain out of it. that's quite scary, and I don't know where humanity is going. I mean, how can we train our kids to not to trust all these sources? Probably, So that's one thing that scares me, and also from looking at from the perspective of who is generating that information and what they want to gain from this, how they want to impact society. That's another concern that I have. So so these are some of the ethical concerns that I usually think about it, and the way this technology is moving and with the speed it's moving. Not that maybe in 10, 20 years, we will have machines that can portray a human, and then how we are going to interact with them, how addicted we are going to be in terms of interaction with those tools, then, kind of what happened to social interactions. So, this is not my field. I don't do research in this area, but I often think about it, and how it's going to impact our society.
I think the answer is the arts. Like, we teach critical thinking. Yeah. There has always been fake news, misinformation in the world. I think where the difference lies to some extent with what we're facing now is the scale and the persuasiveness of and the sheer volume, I think you're suggesting, of the misinformation, and that is in large part because of the way that a lot of the ways that we interact with it are through interfaces and platforms that have bias built into them in a range of ways, and that are manipulating us in particular ways. And so in the Culture and Technology Studies major at the University of Guelph, we're not only teaching people to sort of read the surface critically, that is to say the interface, but to understand the distinction between interface and data and the way that they interact with each other, to try and empower people so that they understand how technologies are working, what's going on under the hood, to an extent that they could start to intervene with that critical perspective in the production of new tools.
If I could throw a negative in there. The OECD does literacy studies of all its nation members. I think there are 37 members of the OECD, but then they also count a whole lot of other countries. And they did one in 2013. They did another one in 2023. The results are miserable. And literacy, you would think, in an advanced country like Canada, the United States, Britain, Germany, should be very high. Well, no. And the only two countries that were in the top were Finland and Japan, with very, very different social systems, but they both prize education very, very much. And then we made it into the, I think we were maybe in the B category, barely, and we were in the middle, that's Canada, and the States was down in the D category, as were the UK and Germany and France, amazingly, because they have very well-developed educational systems. So to come back to some of the points that Suze was making, and Wasita also, is that if levels of literacy and understanding are poor, then literacy in the sense of being able to read and understand a complex argument and figure it out, develop critical abilities and so forth, then what does that say about the abilities of citizens to take those false messages apart, which bombard us every day, and try and figure out where the truth might lie? And we see socially the extent to which that corrosive force has been working on education and universities, because universities are now moving into that untrustworthy category for some people.
So one thing we have to remember, the algorithm behind this information and how it's being customized for the people. The more you watch it, probably you've heard, the more you see it. And that's a hard thing to change, at least at this moment, especially, again, younger or elderlies. I mean, how they interpret that information and how much they trust that information. It's quite scary. Could be scary.
Well, and I think that's the thing that I try to harness in teaching with theater production courses where we're putting things on, is stepping back from the algorithm. When designing or working with actual tangible fabrics and things, don't plug in the dress you want to put into AI to see what it would look like. Think about what fabrics you have and what resilience and the physicality and the tactility. It's to go back to a Jurassic Park point that you made. It's Spielberg saying, I have all this money and early digital computer technology, but I'm only going to use about 80 shots with actual digital technology. The rest are puppets and manipulated objects, so it's using tactile things and going to the technology when we need to, but not relying on the algorithm, not relying on these choices all the time. And that could be one avenue, I think, towards it.
And also design strategy, maybe regulatory regulation should force more transparency. You're seeing the information on the side, you see what the source of information is. It's not too hard to design technology that are transparent and communicate that information effectively.
Good. I was going to say, certainly the EU has been a lot better than we have on this side of the Atlantic at that sort of regulation.
So to what extent are we getting it right now? So, I mean, I think we're touching on the idea that the training we provide in the arts and humanities helps to enable people to deal with technology. Are we doing that right? Are there things we should be doing differently? Is there a way in which the arts and humanities should be influencing the public sphere process and policy? And is that happening the way that it should be? And what's the right mix? Because clearly we need people to be technically educated as well, right? They need to understand the tools as well as the normative aspects of them.
I think what you've described is outreach, because that's what we should be doing. In the past, in arts, we had a whole series of the Café Philosophique, where we had people who had recently written books, and they were downtown here in Guelph, and they talked, and we had big crowds. And so we took the university and the ability to enter into discourse and discussion and critical thought out into the public, because we can't expect to bring all the public here. We get a small percentage of the young people, but that's about all. But we can go out into the world. So I think that is definitely a mission that is really central to what we do, and we don't do enough of it.
I also keep thinking that, like, for me, working in arts disciplines and thinking about work in either literature or drama or even in new technologies, it's about entertaining a possibility beyond the algorithm and other technologies that these things remain open. It's a basic science thing. I don't know the answer. There could be multiple ways to approach this, and ask yourself the question, how do I do this with AI? How do I do this with other types of mediated technologies? How do I do it just as myself? What are those sort of values of it? And what options do I have? Because I get frustrated at times by this notion of there being a consistent answer, or at least the best drawn answer that the language model will take as the first option that often comes up. Entertain that sort of paradox that it's open, that something could have many possibilities. It happens in philosophy, it happens in all sorts of disciplines. But we are working with technologies that try to find an answer for us instead of allow us to entertain that middle ground where there might be multiple paths towards it.
Well, and isn't that the role of literature? Thought experiments. We create thought experiments. What if? What might happen here? And of course, Einstein did that, and he did pretty well with the thought experiments.
I would say part of the answer is also the other kind of open source, open access, open distribution. The university is under attack because it's one of the bulwarks of civil society, along with the law and many other things that we're seeing challenged by, this widespread movement around the world to undermine what it is that we're aiming for. And I think one of the things we often hear is that financial pressures are pushing us towards, like, the box thing that you just buy and then it's easy to maintain and so on and so forth. And it's often harder to go the alternative route. But what we need are those alternatives. It's the, if this, then that. That's an algorithm, right? We need the algorithm of the alternative. We need to have our students making things that, help them understand there are different ways of doing things, that difference matters, that we don't all have to fit into the same slot, the same box, the same category, and that we question the ways that those things order the world for us increasingly through technological structures that we need to push back against.
Yeah, can I say one more thing about that too? I worked with some incredible designers at Simwave VR. They're based out of Ottawa. They create a lot of training systems for the Canadian military, which I don't know what those systems entail, but there are ways to train and work through working with people working in the military. And simple things that are default to them. In Macbeth, you play as one of the three witches, and you have hands that you can manipulate. But the first playthrough had male hands. And I said, these are women, these aren't men. But the default is to have, it brings with it the baggage of bringing a male perspective into this world of these sort of approaches and saying, we want to experience it differently. So asking questions about, and maybe my work can help to ask some designers to think differently the next time they have a client who needs you to play as a witch. I'm not sure who that would be, but these ideas of breaking down the problems that come with these systems and these models that are inherent.
I don't want to sound negative, but the generation we are training right now, absolutely. But just imagine people who are older; they don't have much experience with the technology. We are not doing it fast enough. That's my only. I don't want to say we need more regulations because Canada is quite slow anyway. But anyway, I'm not saying that's the solution. But what can we do to help a slightly older generation or the ones who are not tech savvy to deal with misinformation or other potential consequences? I feel we are a bit slow, but obviously students who come to university, I mean, just younger generation, they have been grown up with technology, and then they will find a way to maneuver or learn quickly. But I'm worried about so slightly bit of a concern about people who are not tech savvy.
It's no good to go out and lecture people, because that turns them off. And so, that's where the arts come in. Because what do? We're storytellers. And so whether it's a written story or a dramatic story or a film, we tell stories. And that's how we get to people. Because when I start out my classes in BAS, I used to say, well, most people when they leave high school, that's the last engagement they have with any serious science, unless they do a science career or they have some job where they have to learn some technological some technology, but most people just drop it. Now, only the crazies, like me, will go off and read a science book because we're interested in it. So where do most people learn that? Movies. Science fiction movies, of which there are very many good ones since 68 and 2001 Space Odyssey, where science fiction got serious and brought real science in, and there's a lot of junk out there. But nonetheless, that's the place to go, storytelling. Make it entertaining.
So yeah, maybe we could just switch to sort of accentuating the positive a little bit and sort of the pathways that technology opens up for the arts, culture, humanity. So I guess we've been dwelling on the responsibilities that we have in those disciplines, but also are there opportunities, are there ways we could do art in new ways that are new forms of artistic expression, or artistic expression that is more democratic than it has been in the past? Is there an upside to LLMs?
I think there is, but some of it is not the LLMs yet. But I think there is upswing to thinking about what these things can yield. I've been thinking a lot about the broadcasting and live streaming and digital streaming of anything. I don't care what it is, a moon landing, a sports game, an eagle nest, whatever it happens to be. There are ways to think about what these options are providing to us for new potential that is sort of untapped. The NFL broadcasts American football games, and you can download a way to change your angle at any point and listen to different mics and play with feeds. Of course, no one watches it that way on the TV. That's fine. But there might be a way to use that system to create some sort of a collaborative performance where you could follow different characters and move through different sort of spaces. I go back to one that I saw during the pandemic when a group out of Massachusetts did a performance play during lockdown when people were wearing masks, but you would load in with a character named Charlie who was wearing a GoPro on his head. And you could say, Charlie, walk up to the left. And he would walk through a theater and open a program and interact with any of the props backstage. And it was a great chance to experiment and think about a play on Zoom that you could literally control the character. And I've never had that experience again, and I don't know if I will. But maybe there's options out there that remain untapped, that yield so much potential. And hopefully, if we're thinking about telling stories in the arts, what can these technologies help us to tell a new side of a story, a new underrepresented part of that story?
I think if we look at what's going on in our neighbor to the south, all those different groups are being attacked by the American government right now, they've got to tell their stories. And clearly a lot of Americans don't believe their stories or don't know their stories. And so all those institutions, universities, the justice system, on it goes, have to tell their story in a new way that actually touches people. And that's a big problem, because how do you actually get through to people who've got a very negative attitude towards you?
So I'll quickly say something, because this is not really my area, but I think what Susan is doing, or that type of platform, access to arts, and the fact that you can search millions and billions of records and, painting and, access to that. And then also LLMs or that type of algorithms that they can put tag on painting or the type of art that's not in the form of text for you to make it searchable and get access to it. This is quite fascinating. And also the sophisticated algorithms that can mine, integrate that information to get and to generate either new patterns or inform you about what's out there or what you can do. I think that's quite fascinating. Again, it's not my area, but access to that is definitely is going to change the arts in the future.
I mean, luckily you're sitting next to a person whose area it is. So Susan, what do you think about the semantic web and the ways in which that will improve culture?
Well, I do think so. Semantic web technology is really about, trying to build meaning into technologies, and it actually comes out of an earlier phase of AI that is quite different from machine learning, that sort of tried to put the human organization of the world at the center and build on language structures. And whereas LLMs are very statistically oriented to sort of just like give you the, base the results on probability in a very sophisticated way, but still it's like not based on semantics in the same way. So, I mean, I think there's some interesting work being done trying to bring these two things together. And I think that if we're trying to think about what does ethical AI look like in the future, something that does draw on this sort of more ordered, semantically structured understanding of the world to do the sorts of things you're talking about, like one of the impoverishments of our online environments, of course, is around things like gender, that where, most platforms are actually just doing binary things under the hood, even though that's not the way we would understand gender in, contemporary culture, and certainly not in the context of a university. And yet the work involved in trying to nuance that is really tough. But if you have, the ability to draw on these massive knowledge bases and then pull that in a way that is designed by humans in collaboration with machines to give the sort of more complex story, I think there's real potential there for sure. What we have to deal with is the hallucination problem and the problem of evidence and truth, right? Generative AI is like Shawn Michaels' novel, Do You Remember When You Were Born, is a really interesting experiment of co-authoring a novel with AI. Really, really nicely done. And obviously, that's imagination, right? You're not worried about sort of any kind of ground truth there. The challenge I find in the little experimentation that I've done with large language models is that the better they get, the more convincing their hallucinations are, right? And so I would never trust an AI in a field in which I didn't know it really well, because even in fields where I know my stuff, I've been caught out once or twice thinking, oh, actually, I know that's not true. Why am I believing this? I'm believing it because it's plausible, because that's what they do. They create plausibility, right? And that is, so, I mean, I think there will be, as Peter said, like, people are always appropriating technology and skewing it and, pushing against it and appropriating it in imaginative ways. That will continue to happen. But we do need a space, open spaces that are not governed by financial interests and sort of profit in which to do those. And for that, we need, a society that makes space and provides resources for that kind of work. And that's I'd say in many ways, that's the big challenge of our moment, is to not let the continued appropriation of all of this wealth that comes from us, that comes from human culture and human history, being simply funneled into money-making machines, which is what most platforms are.
So you mentioned resistance at the very beginning. I don't know if this is a resistance movement, but I think one of the things that is our job is to help educate and train young people, or anyone who wants to listen outside of the university, of course, too, to give them the tools of self-empowerment, to understand critically the bombardment that's hitting us every day of information from 1,000 different sources, and trying to figure out then, well, what is true? Oh, it sounds pretty good, but how can I tell the truth from the falsehood?
Yeah, we want them to ask what is truth, but actually stay for the answer. Yeah. So unfortunately we're about out of time. So thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this discussion. It's been wide ranging. It's been fascinating. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you. We have the opportunity now for some Q&A from the audience, particularly if there's sort of themes that we didn't pick up on in this discussion you want to bring out, ask the panel for their opinion, then step on up. We've got a couple of mics set up, and we're interested to hear your questions. Please do. There's a mic there if you don't want to go into that. Thank you.
Thank you all. So my question is actually, I teach computer science, especially to first-year students, and I think technology is a nuisance at this point, at least. I would like to know the perspective of, for example, Peter, who teaches theater. I mean, how do you train your students to use tools like ChatGPT responsibly and ethically?
Yeah, no, I agree with you that I think it's definitely a nuisance in so many ways. And I think for me, it goes back to, for me, dramaturgical processes of taking text and working with text and saying to ourselves, what are all the possibilities of why someone chooses to say this versus that, which is the same thing with ChatGPT. It'll choose to say things a certain way. So stepping back from these things and asking them to really unpack those elements within a text and think about how they make them feel and how they sponsor feelings and work within them. Some of it comes from trying to not use it at all and work practically. But strategies as simple as like running sort of like design and discussion meetings with our computers closed and asking ourselves what sort of tones, what sort of thoughts. We can ask, AI to tell us these things, but if you can read it within the text, there's probably a kernel of truth as to why a playwright has put it there. So let's expand on that. And I keep reminding them that that's how actors and directors have worked for centuries, because otherwise we would just stop performing these plays because we do it once and we don't need to do it again. It's perfect. So ultimately, it's really that sort of deep textual analysis and really asking them to think things through. And I think it helps to tell them that there are really no wrong answers in the arts. Creativity has a lot of paths that can sprout, and letting that be that truth to them. I want to know their process, not necessarily their result, which is what ChatGPT would give us, a result, a goal of things.
Mm-hmm. A follow-up question. So in your assessments, graded assessments, do you consider the option of, or like, for example, we check for plagiarism. We have tools to do that. Do you do that in your?
Absolutely. They're still checking for that for submitted assignments. And sometimes it's been as fascinating as discovering things that are cited that are by colleagues that they never wrote, that I find in their work cited. I'm like, I know this person, they didn't write this. And it's a collaboration. But it's actually probably going back to something that I really value, which will be not exhaustive exams, but exams that are about like, here are a couple speeches from A Doll's House or from Miss Julie. What do these translated speeches into English mean to you as an audience member? How would you communicate the feelings from Ibsen or others as to what's being said? And reminding them that like outlining your work in other sciences, I want to know your process for arriving at how that comes together.
Thank you.
Don, did you want to?
Yeah, I just want to follow up on that a little bit too, because of course one of the great dangers, as we all know, with these new technologies, is where some people just go and take it and use it, and plagiarism. Well, it's not even plagiarism because it's been created, but replace their work that they didn't do with that. And I think you won't get everybody all the time. You won't convince everybody all the time. But most students, and we've been doing this certainly a lot in BS for the last years, that continuing discussion about why you're here. Mm-hmm. You're here to learn something for you. And you want to walk out of this place with transferable knowledge, transferable skills, a development of yourself as a person, a better understanding of others, like a whole range of things. And yeah, okay, you can try to cheat in certain places, you might get away with it, but it won't help you once you get out there, because if you don't have anything up here, it's going to show up pretty quickly. And so these are life skills that you're developing for yourself. And I think I've certainly seen in the many discussions I've had with students, most people get that. They figure that out, that yes, it's tough, yes, it's hard, but that's the better path to go rather than to use the path of false means and false representations.
Yeah, all our colleagues could talk about this for hours. I think they were very exercised by that. Excellent question. I know I cut you off, and I know you wanted to talk about ChatGPT. So, do you want to go ahead, Susan?
I guess I would just say that I think it puts pressure on us and our teaching methods and our assessment methods. If an LLM can produce something, it's not actually useful for a student to learn how to do that anymore. And so process, iterative assignments, assignments that involve engaging with materials in different ways than the sort of classic essay that we've tended to write in the humanities for decades now, I think they are sometimes a challenge because they're more time consuming to grade. They take careful thought to design in ways that we're not used to, and so on. But I think it will help us to try to figure out how we keep education relevant in the age of AI.
And interestingly, that might move us back more to what has been practiced in many parts of the world before, more consistently, is oral exams, which sometimes are stressful. Yes, that is true. But developing the skills of thinking on your feet and being able to respond to questions is a pretty useful thing to do. And so we don't do very much of that at all. And that requires being able to use the knowledge you've acquired and to pull things together and create understandable responses to a particular question. So I think that might be another stressful for some people means, but one of many other ways of ascertaining knowledge and understanding in students.
Oh, bring back the Viva, yeah. Rosita, you probably understand the tech better than any of the rest of us, so what are your strategies?
For us, it's easy. I mean, I teach privacy, and students used to write essays. Now it's no longer a required assignment. So quiz and test, hard copy, they have to write, and they always complain because I have lost my skill in writing, and also design. Lots of design, survey, research. I don't give essays. I mean, there is a way for me to escape that and do other things, but it is quite challenging because you want students to think deeply about privacy and social implications of privacy, but it has become discussion in the class, and students are being marked for it, so using new technologies, clickers and being involved in the class. So that's unfortunate. But I have no idea what. So you mentioned you can track to know whether it has been AI generated, because I've heard that the accuracy is low and we are not supposed to do it. I want.
Well, I'll put it this way: like when something appears suspicious, the accuracy is low, and it's not an official way to do it. It's starting to check sources and check things like when students have a large understanding of black theater in London, UK in the 1980s, but no sources or proper playwrights' names or actors' names, it's like, that's a big hint, and we'll have that conversation. Yes. But then it's also like it's not just using, like it used to be, Turnitin and the different ways that these things would be sourced. It's the same dramaturgical process I asked them to do with a play that I'm using on their own writing. When their own writing model shifts from paragraph to paragraph in weird ways, it's enough to have a kind meeting to ask, tell me more about these 6 theaters that you know so much about, just to see what could be happening there. Likewise, I also think the other thing I'm trying to do in the arts is experiential reflections and work on process, because I always remind them, the shows we put on here at the University of Guelph are fun, exciting, everyone has roles, but you're not going to lose your job. You're going to learn on the fly, you're going to adapt. And I want you to reflect on those things before you're in a less forgiving industry with different standards that are important, that more is on the line. So reflect on that. And they complain about that as much. They're like, why do I have to write from my perspective? I'm like, because ChatGPT won't know how you felt about the stage manager or the play. You need to tell us how you felt about how it went. And experience is a big part of it.
In all the BS courses, they all do a reflective text at the end, and it's what was the impact of the learning on them.
Yeah.
So bring out 3 learning moments. What did you learn from that, and what was the impact on you for you going forward? How has it changed you in some way? And I often find that they've been doing that now for a number of years, that often a lot of really insightful texts come out of that because they're forced to think about it from one course to the next and actually start interrogating themselves about what they've learned and what the impact has been on them.
Yeah. As you can tell, we can talk about this for hours. We all really deeply care about how we teach our students properly in an age of ChatGPT and so on. And actually, I thought that was a great set of answers. But I'd like to know if there's any more questions, if you want us to go off in a different direction in the discussion from the audience. Is that a hand back there? Please come on up.
Hi, thank you for the wonderful panel. I just wanted to ask if any of you can comment on the environmental aspect of the ethics, right? I mean, like with co-authoring novels or like getting people to use ChatGPT to do some of these assignments in the collaborative way, we also have to know that like it's dumping, each prompt is like dumping 5 buckets of water. So how do we talk about that with students, and can arts help with that?
I love that question. I was just reading recently about who was complaining about the environmental impact of saying please and thank you to Siri and so on. So yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it comes back again to the politics of the technologies. Like just to build a computer, you're using rare earth materials, and the disposability of computers. There's a green computing movement that looks at trying to minimize processing costs. There's minimal computing has come out of the digital humanities, sort of essentially. How can we continue to benefit from technology, but try to minimize our footprint on the earth? So there are journals that will only, like the server will only go on if you like try to access from it instead of like running 24/7, which is what servers typically do. There's also some really interesting work by Noelani Arista and others on coming out of Indigenous perspectives on making kin with machines. The problem is a much larger one than any particular technology like an LLM. It's that we have the same kind of extractive relationship to the earth that is informing the platforms that are such a problem in other contexts, right? That if we think about our relation to the earth in different ways, in the ways that I think we can learn a great deal from various Indigenous epistemologies, then that could become a starting point for thinking not just about our computer use, which I think, there should be a little ticker or something that tells you what kind of energy you're using when you send out like a reply all, or ask Siri a question, or use Google Maps constantly because you have no sense of direction left because you're outsourcing that. So yeah, I think it comes down to actually social values and how we decide on those collectively, and some of those ways of deciding on our collective values are very much under threat right now, and figuring out sort of shifts in our ways of thinking and our ways of being in the world, which is huge, but also, I think we're coming to realize, necessary if we're going to continue to survive as a species.
And one thing, of course, to note is that it's all come upon us so fast. Think of human history. And for the most part, we didn't go far from home. We lived barely existence in an existence mode, and in the last 150, 200 years, whoosh, it's just gone up like that. In the last 50 years, even more so.
So just wanted to say I completely agree with you. It's this technology is so new. We are constantly learning. And as we try to learn and advance in one aspect, there's a new technology. And then I have a student, PhD student, who just graduated. She's the head of data and AI in Thomson Reuters. And she said they were working on this, ethical framework for text processing. As you know, Thomson Reuters is a kind of a very established. It has been around for a long time. So they were trying to build this ethical framework for text processing and then LLM. And she said we dropped everything and focused on LLM, and it continues because this technology evolves. I think as a society we have to learn, because the way we approach governance, we have to understand the risk. So I'm a consultant with the government of Ontario on AI technology. We go to these meetings, everybody talks about risk. And when you ask, what's the risk? What are the risks? They have no idea, because for me to come up with a governance solution, I have to, even if it is a social risk, ethical risk, or technology risk, I have to be able to explain it, to be able to design it in a way that I find solution. We are not learning what the risk, and we are moving to the next one, and obviously our regulation is, I mean, if you look at Dubai, they have a regulation in 6 months. For us, it's 5 years, goes through several review process. So I think we have to get to a point that this technology slows down or is on a plateau, and then we, as a society, start learning what are the harms, what are the, so I think it's, when somebody asks me, so how do you speak with the students not to use large language model, ChatGPT, when I have master's students who have 3 heavy courses in 1 semester, and they, even for AI, they use ChatGPT to give they share the problem, they get the code. I have no idea what other way to find to make these students to write the code on their own, or actually think critically about the code. So everything is moving too fast. We are under a lot of pressure. We need time to think as a society, look back and, decide maybe new social contract, ethical theory, so I don't know. But basically it's hard to do it right now, I think.
Yeah, on that note of everything moving really fast, I think we might have time for one more question. Come on up.
Regarding the use of digital technology, which is very prominent these days, how would this affect anybody who doesn't have the technology, such as needing any digital technology to get by, which is kind of like needing a smartphone these days? If you don't have one, how are you going to get by in the future when all the digital technology is going to take over the world and then there's no old-fashioned things left?
Great question. Excellent question. What do you think?
Yeah.
Well, we saw this during the pandemic, right? When public libraries were one of the major infrastructures that had to sort of stay open as much as possible, because there are people who are street involved and or otherwise, don't have access to technology, who needed to have access to the computers in the public library in order to get their checks to get by. So, I mean, the gap in terms of, it's not just the sort of global gap in which, as we know, there are countries where people don't have computers at all. They may have smartphones. Their bandwidth is very limited and so on. There's northern areas of Canada. There's disparity within our own communities that is absolutely creating a whole class of have-nots, people who don't have the same access. And it is so important. I mean, we've been very down on the impact of culture, the impact on culture in a range of ways, and the impact on the arts. But when I imagine what a queer child growing up in Labrador in the 1970s would have felt, in a very small community, as compared to, the ability of a child struggling with their sexual identity and trying to find community now, like it's just a massive shift, right, in what can contribute to people's lived experience in very positive ways. And so overcoming those, what's often called the digital divide in those different contexts, I think we're going to come up very soon with notions that human rights require access to data, right? Not just the data about us, but access to interact with data and technology. So I think it's a very, very important question.
Yeah. Any other thoughts or?
I would just reiterate that this kind of, we solve one problem and then we create another, reminds me of I brought the Shakespeare experiences to the Stratford Festival for an educational week. And I had a teacher say, "This is amazing. I live on Manitoulin Island and now I don't have to bring all my students to Stratford. But we don't have a VR headset, so how do we use it?" And it creates that the class issue still persists. Maybe there's going to be less environmental damage from the travel and the time, but there could be just as much getting them all the VR sets and running on networking and all of that. So it's a constant solution and problem and that rotation through. And I just want to agree with a lot of what Susan said, but also that story to me really strikes me as something that opens a world and closes another very quickly. So,
of course, a corollary to that is our addiction to screens and the scourge that cell phones have been for young people. They do many, many good things for us. They're tremendous Swiss Army knives. They do 1,000 things. But for young people, they've been very destructive. And so the work of Jonathan Haidt, for example, has been quite good on this, where they've looked at the impact on young women, on young men who've had access to social media far too early. So that one problem leads to the other. Give them screens so that, in fact, more people have access, but then what can that also lead to?
All right, thanks. Actually, I think we do have time for one more question if there is one. So,
Anybody else?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for your question.
I'll share just two quick thoughts first. First, with the green AI, I know Monsef, in the Dean of College of Engineering and Physical Sciences, that's a huge priority for him. So just doing research in that area. And then I also heard this amazing thing where someone was talking about, I hope that we'll look back in a couple years' time of people just sitting in a room looking at their phones the way that we look at people smoking in a plane. Like, perhaps we will come a long way. So I just hold on to that vision. But I work with donors, and so always I'm trying to convey like the value of supporting higher education, and we talk about higher education for knowledge creation and knowledge dissemination. And what you've been talking about today about how you speak with students is more than just that practical knowledge dissemination. You're doing a lot of like character development and talking about why things are important and why it's important to learn, why it's important to reflect on how you feel. Do you feel that that's changed over the years with technology, or has there always been character sort of teaching along the way with actual just practical knowledge as well?
So I started teaching social implications of technology maybe a year after I joined University of Guelph. So I could I could see in students that every year when they came to the class, they had way more knowledge about, the social implications. I mean, they, for some reason, maybe at school, they were, or maybe game, or I don't know, how they got exposed to think about the social implications of this technology. Did it change their attitude toward technology, or in the future? I think it probably did. Not maybe they use LLM to generate their course assignment, but generally they were thinking very critically about the social implications. Maybe it was the group who was interested who took the course because it was elective. I don't know, but anyway, over time I noticed that they are thinking more critically about the impact of technology and the ethical use of it.
I agree with that. The Generation Z students we have now, all born essentially since 2000s, I find them much, much more aware of the positives and negatives of new technologies. The positives, how they can use it creatively, but also then the negatives of the harms that it can inflict.
Yeah, and I'd also iterate that, like, I can recall the instructors or the teachers that I had at different points in my career who weren't afraid to confront technology with me and not have all the answers, that had that impact on growth of me as a person. And I think that's part of it, not being, VR is so new to so many people that a lot of people just avoid it when I want them to play it. And I'm like, let's try it out, let's talk it through, let's think about it, and think about what that does to grow a person, to ask them about these questions. And I think every time one of my students steps back and asks a question that they might not want to fall into the norm or the stereotype or what the LLM is telling them is the answer or the thing, and think a little differently, shows that growth, that potential is still there. So I try to be a heartfelt way to say, like, I can see those moments where people equally said, think twice about it, step back from it. We're not afraid of technology, but maybe we can think about it more critically.
I mean, I come from a discipline that sort of positioned literature as opposite the machine with the Romantics. And it's, in some sense, never left that. There's sort of a sense that books are an alternative, not a technology in and of themselves. But I think it has become easier to engage students in thinking critically about these things precisely because computers in our lives and phones in particular are identity machines. Like they're so caught up in how they live their lives. There is no real distinction between real life and virtual life anymore as their social lives go, for the most part, right? And so then it becomes, I think, a lot easier to make the stakes clear and for them to appreciate the value of thinking with care and they're so much more aware of, I think, the mental health implications and so on than they used to be. So there's a lot of fertile ground there, I think, that can be sowed.
Okay, thank you so much. Unfortunately, I think we're out of time, but thank you for those questions. That sparked more interesting discussion, I thought. Thank you so much for your conversation as part of this panel. Peter, Susan, Rosita, Don, it was very interesting to me. So I hope you had a good time. And thank you very much. Yeah.